Thank you very much, Chair. Pleasure to have you here. And in your expert opinion, do you think the proposed numbers and estimated capital grant funding presented by our first esteemed panel, do you think that's the best way to deliver more social and affordable rented homes? Professor Gibb?
I might ask you to clarify that question a little bit. So, I mean, do you mean the number that they've ended up with, or do you mean?
So we've got various targets
Yes.
which we discussed with the previous panel, and the numbers that they're proposing, and also the estimated capital grant funding. Those numbers that we discussed. Do you think that's the right way to deliver?
I think that the analysis, particularly Glenn Bramley's analysis that was talked about in the earlier session, broadly makes sense. I think the kind of level of estimates it arrives at seems to be sensible. I think the history of recent decades suggests that a grant-funded mixed funding scheme works. It seems to be almost a necessary component of getting back to the levels of social housing we had before. So some kind of grant funding element seems an inevitable part of this. What that levels at and the scale of the programme is clearly a political decision, as we were hearing about earlier.
Okay. Ms. Callan, would you disagree, or do you think that's a good response to you?
There has to be some form of subsidy to enable subsidised housing to be built, and the form that's chosen will depend partly on the institutional structures and the history around the sector, and grant funding has been fundamental to the sector for a long time, but it isn't the only way that it can be done. Other countries do it different ways. We've heard some discussion about the mechanism of cheap or free public land, and that's another way of providing subsidy. And it's also possible to do it with tax incentives. In Germany, in the States, in Australia, what we call social housing is actually provided by private developers using a tax incentive mechanism.
Okay, and Professor Cole?
Yes, in terms of the analysis, I think the Glenn Bramley model is probably the best that we have, and the way it's aggregated up from local analysis I think is important, because as has been already stated in the previous session, you have a series of the sort of local distributional effects of the imbalance between supply and demand are very important, and the fact it's dynamic, as has been pointed out, that the two interrelate. So I think they're its strengths. I think it is worth perhaps, though, the committee being aware of the fact that those kind of estimates of shortfall have been challenged, and that has provoked a debate in itself, not least through Cash that Ken was the director of, whereby Ian Mulhern, who's an ex-Treasury economist, now writing for the Tony Blair Institute, has suggested that household growth in the last few years has fallen behind the growth of supply, not new build but supply, and that perhaps we're all getting a bit overheated. That in itself has provoked a response back from Professor Bramley and also from Professor Jeff Mean, who's written extensively on this to suggest that some of the assumptions that are being challenged by Ian Mulhern are themselves rather suspect. So without going into technicalities, but we could certainly send you the discussion and the riposte to that. But I do think it's worth saying that you can start from a different place. And as with many of these things, depending on what particular trends you emphasise, you might end up in a different place.
Okay, well, look, it's always good to see academic scrutiny and debate, as we're used to here within the House as well. But in your opinion, how does the government balance, on the one hand, improving home ownership, but on the other hand, improving access to affordable rented homes? Are the two actually compatible?
Yes, they are. If one looks, I mean, the sense that if you were to increase social housing investment, would you crowd out private investment in private homes? There might be issues around land costs and construction costs, but work that Savills have undertaken, which is included in the evidence to the committee, suggests that the additionality of additional social homes would actually be 100% rather than creating a kind of substitution effect. And I guess if you look historically, private housing completions have remained relatively steady since the Second World War. What has varied, the variable in it, has been social housing completions, which have obviously fallen from a much higher level in the 1960s and 70s. But that has not in itself diminished the private housing completions. The kind of drip effect of developers building in order to hit their margins and not flood markets means that has been a fairly constant effect. So I think one could suggest that there would not be a threat to the continuation of private development.
That's very good to hear. Professor Gibb, you wrote that there was no silver bullet to deliver submarket housing and only a finite set of ways to choose from. Well, what are your preferred ways?
Well, I think what I was trying to get at was that there isn't, there isn't a free way to do this. As Kath said, subsidised housing by definition, it kind of implies that there has to be a subsidy. Somebody has to pay for that somewhere. Be it an individual, be it a business, be it a taxpayer. Somebody's going to pay to make that work, and that might be spread over a long period of time, or it might be up front. So, and underlying that, and kind of goes back to the last question, underlying that is the political commitment to either redistribute the existing housing spend or to add to it to deliver these things. So I guess I favour mixed funding with grant funding within it, because there's a degree of institutional familiarity with it. Admittedly, it's declining from familiarity, but I think our experience in Scotland in the last 10 years suggests that grant funding has extra legs, in the sense that we provide upfront capital grant funding for councils to build social housing, and that's been pretty successful.
Okay. Ms. Gallen, what do you think are the main reasons why low numbers of social and affordable rented homes are being built at the moment, and how can we overcome that problem? And in particular, please do feel free to explain to the committee about the different obstacles in different parts of the country, so variations, to elaborate on your response.
Well, grant funding for provision of new social housing has declined dramatically in the last decade or so. So there's been a reliance on other mechanisms for providing social housing, and particularly Section 106 developer obligations connected with the construction of private homes. So those Section 106 affordable homes are paid for through the profits on the sale of market housing. It's a pro-cyclical way of doing it. So when there's a lot of construction for the market, you get commensurately more construction for affordable housing. But that's arguably the wrong way around. We shouldn't be doing it on the back of the market, but it should rather be filling in the gap with affordable housing when the market goes down. It also means that you get a kind of what's been called a dumbbell configuration of housing being produced, because the social housing and affordable housing is paid for through the profits from the market housing, then you have to produce expensive market housing to make enough profits to pay for the social housing. So that's one feature of the system. Also, as we've heard this morning, the decline in grant funding and the consolidation of housing associations into bigger kind of national groups that are really now on a par with the biggest private developers means that they operate a kind of internal cross-subsidy model where they develop homes for sale and use the profits from that development to fund their social and affordable housing. So that exposes them to the same market risks and pro-cyclicality that we have in the for-profit developer market.
Okay. Thank you, Arch.